My name is Father Francesco. I am the oldest priest, still serving the Bourbon court in Madrid. It is the autumn of 1833, and the palace feels damp and cold. Red velvet drapes throw sickly yellow light across marble floors. I have spent 40 years saying Mass and hearing confessions for princes and footmen alike. I know. But tonight, I face a secret heavier than any I have carried. 3 deep strokes ring from the bell of San Miguel. The young guard runs to my door, pale and shaking. Father, His Majesty is dying. The Queen Regent needs you now. I take my black cassock, tighten the white rope belt, and lift a small oil lamp. The flame shivers, just like my own hands. The corridor to the king's chambers looks like a tunnel to the underworld. I smell incense, strong liquor, and bitter medicine. My heartbeat sounds like a funeral drum in my ears. When the dark wooden door opens, Queen Maria Cristina is waiting. Her mourning dress hugs her thin frame. Her eyes are red, yet she still holds herself like a ruler. She grasps my fingers so hard they hurt. Father, listen to his last words. Give him what mercy. You can. I nod, whispering a Latin prayer. Behind her, 3 doctors in white coats stand stiff and silent. From their tight faces, I understand there is no hope left. King Ferdinand VII lies on a heavy bed covered in ivory silk. For 20 years, Spain called him first the desired one, then the traitor. Now his breath rattles under thick blankets. Gout has swollen his cheeks. Gray-beard hairs point in every direction, yet his lips still curl into a mocking smile. The last time he confessed to me, 2 months ago, he hissed, my greatest sin is being betrayed from birth. Tonight, his body trembles, but his stare is icy, as if he still refuses to bow even to God. The Queen waves everyone away, and only she, the king, and I remain. She sinks to her knees beside the bed. I stand at the headboard, gospel pressed to my chest. Far outside, a carriage clatters across the Plaza de Orient, then fades. Ferdinand's life is closing, but I know the storm his death will unleash will fall on my shoulders. I have carried the court's darkest confessions. Now I must decide what to reveal and what to bury forever. I lean close and speak softly, Your Majesty. If any sin still weighs on you, entrust it to God and to his servant. His cracked lips move. I bend nearer. A whisper mixed with the stench of drugs reaches me. Fran sees. I fear hell. I lay a hand on his burning forehead. The other clutches my rosary. Tears roll down the Queen's cheeks. I begin the prayer of absolution, but Ferdinand grabs my sleeve with surprising strength. His eyes blaze. Secret in the vault. Protect it. His voice breaks. His hand slips away. Church bells toll long and slow. Ferdinand VII, King of Spain, is gone. He did not finish his confessional. He chose to keep the worst locked inside. Yet I already know the stories, the screams of queens, the strange pillows, the leather straps, the whispers of doctors. I heard them all through the lattice of the confessional, as guards lay a white cloth over the corpse. The Queen speaks in a hoarse whisper. Father Francesco, he begged us to hide his sins. But those sins have ruined so many lives. Silence. Still mercy? I give no answer. In that moment, I feel a war inside my soul. The seal of confession commands silence. But love for the living cries for truth. The future of Spain now presses on one aging priest. I leave the chamber just before dawn. Pale pink light crawls over the rooftops. Pigeons flutter above the square. The chapel bell rings again. I grip my Bible and breathe the cold air. The nightmare is not over. It has only just changed shape. Yet I also feel a hard resolve. I will write everything I have seen, not to shame the dead, but to warn the living. Absolute power in a wounded soul can turn a palace into a prison of blood and tears. That secret journal lies before you now. If you still believe in God's justice, walk with me. We will lift each veil. Hear each desperate prayer, and follow the path that led a broken man to break a kingdom. I, Father Francesco, begin my testimony with compassion, with dread, and with hope that light can grow even from such darkness. I did not close my eyes the night Ferdinand died. Gray dawn crept over the palace roofs while a single question pounded. In my skull, how can one's soul warp so terribly? To judge the king honestly, I had to start long before his first breath, so I turned to archives. 2 confessional memories, 2 letters hidden behind chapel bricks. Spain's Habsburgs and Bourbons had wedded cousin to cousin for centuries, praising pure blood while physicians like me whispered a simpler verdict: poison. By Ferdinand's day, the family tree no longer rose, curled back on itself like a snake devouring its tail. King Charles II, centuries earlier, could not chew bread. An infanta was born with 5 fingers fused into 2. Parish logs recorded stillborn heirs as casually as rainstorms. Toned. Into this blighted garden, Ferdinand arrived on the 14th of October, 1784. A midwife later confessed to me that the newborn's proportions were so strange she crossed herself twice, once in thanks, once in fear, because beneath the blanket something swelled unnaturally. I first met the boy at 9 during his rehearsal. For First Communion, 2 brothers knelt beside him in velvet, yet only Ferdinand shifted in pain. Under his breeches, a padded strap shielded tender flesh from even the weight of standing. Tutors praised his quick mind, but noted suspicion in every glance. If another child laughed, Ferdinand assumed mockery. If a servant stared too long, he demanded the man be whipped. One evening, behind the grill, he whispered, "They sneer at me, father. They know about it." When I asked what it meant, silence swallowed the booth, then a thin voice answered, "Mother says I must never speak of my shame." Queen Maria Louisa carried guilt like a hidden rosary. Or more than once she sobbed to me that marrying her cousin, Charles, was God's punishment. Yet she returned each year to the same sin, another pregnancy and the same cursed blood. I gave her absolution and hated how light words felt beside the weight of twisted lives. Cruelty sprouted early. At 15, Ferdinand caught a page boy who had blundered into the bathing hall. The youth claimed curiosity, nothing more. Ferdinand ordered 40 lashes and exile of the boy's family to Aragon. Courtiers whispered the penalty was savage. Prince replied, "Better fear than laughter." When I challenged him, he stared through me with eyes far older than 15. "You heal souls," he said. "I defend mine." Another day, he attempted to ride a stallion without the special cushions made by royal saddlers. The horse reared. At the uneven weight, throwing him hard, 2 ribs cracked. In fury, he ordered the animal killed. The stable master refused and vanished before dawn. His wife came weeping to my confessional, certain her husband lay in the Manzanares. I could offer only prayers.
By 17, the court doctor's notebooks described an organ already 10 inches long at rest, curving like a shepherd's crook and thickening near the tip to grotesque width. Leaching ice baths, coral tinctures, nothing slowed its growth. French surgeons recommended cutting, but Spanish tradition forbade altering a royal body. Ferdinand drank rhinoceros horn potions, mercury elixirs, any vial promising normalcy, and grew steadily sicker. When an Italian surgeon dared sketch the deformity, he was found beaten in an alley, papers gone. Rumor said those diagrams mapped the prince's anatomy like a hostile coastline. Power came early as his father, preferred hunting to governing. Courtiers treated the 17-year-old as a shadow king, and he tasted respect for the first time. Yet whispers followed him everywhere. One Easter, a candle toppled, filling the chapel with smoke. A group of girls coughed, and he thought they laughed. That night, he dismissed the entire palace choir and imported singers from Naples who spoke no Spanish, fewer tongues to wag. He declared, "I begged him to choose mercy." He answered, "Mercy is a luxury for men who don't bleed shame every morning." Writing, "These lines, my palms, are icy. A confessor holds keys to damnation and salvation alike. Secrets must be guarded, yet those very secrets let the curse fester, prince to king, chamber to kingdom." I recall Maria Antonia, his first bride, sobbing in the sanctuary after their wedding night. She described pain like iron tearing flesh and pleaded for annulment. I granted a hollow blessing. 5 years later, she died brittle as burned. Parchment. I buried her beneath the Almudena and wondered whether I had buried my courage with her. If I had shouted truth, then, would history have swerved? The seal of confession is tighter than iron, and the wheel rolled on crushing another. Queen, another physician, another servant. While Ferdinand's body bent out of nature, so did his realm. Reformers drafted charters. He burned them. Colonies begged fair trade. He taxed them into revolt. He scoured mirrors for proof of manhood, while across the Atlantic provinces renounced his rule. I preached patience from the pulpit, but peasants wanted bread, not sermons. Bandits ruled the roads, soldiers deserted, and still the king obsessed over silk cushions and lunar calendars said to enhance fertility. The rot of one bedroom seeped through marble walls and pooled in every gutter. Of Madrid, that is the bloodline's curse. Twisted flesh, birthing twisted power. Fear breeding more fear, until an entire nation aches. Some will call this testimony treachery. So be it. A priest must serve truth before thrones. Spain stands at a crossroads. Baby Isabella sleeps above me as I write. Unaware half the land doubts her right to the crown. Carlist banners rise in the north. Liberals conspire in coffee houses. And common folk whisper that God has abandoned us because our rulers defy nature. If I keep silent, I join the countless men whose discretion fertilized disaster. So I set down every sorrowful root of Ferdinand's life, praying future kings read and tremble. Soon I will chronicle the royal marriages unions forged in desperation. Soaked in laudanum, ending in blood. Each confession cut me like a blade, yet each shows how private torment becomes national tragedy when locked beneath a crown. May God forgive the dead, heal the living, and guide my pen toward mercy and truth. I had thought I understood sorrow after Maria Antonia's funeral, but the years that followed schooled me in new gradations of grief. Her death did nothing to loosen the vice around Ferdinand's heart. Instead, it hardened him, like iron plunged from flame into frigid water. Within 6 weeks, he was studying miniatures of eligible princesses, as though a new womb could erase the stench of laudanum that still clung to the bed curtains. He summoned me to the oratory one evening, candlelight shivering across his face. "Find me a bride who will not break," he whispered. And in that moment, I glimpsed the bottomless pit his soul had become love, and duty melted into a single monstrous appetite for validation. Isabel of Braganza arrived from Lisbon in silks, the color of dawn, believing herself the focus of a grand romance. During her first confession, she thanked God for a gentle husband. I watched her delicate hands tremble as she spoke of bouquets, serenades, and letters written in Ferdinand's curling hand. She had not yet seen the contraptions waiting in the bridal chamber. Cushions stiff as saddles, leather straps too thick for prayer books, oils that smelled of butcher shops rather than boudoirs. I blessed her, knowing that my words were flimsy. Shields against what awaited her after Vespers. That wedding night shattered more than innocence. Servants carried Isabel from the bed near dawn, her nightdress crimson at the hem. Ferdinand paced the corridor, demanding why God mocked him, while the Queen's ladies packed snow against her swollen thighs. I was called to hear her cries twist into delirious giggles, the mind's last defense when flesh can bear no more. As dawn bloomed over Madrid's tiles, she begged me not for healing, but for invisibility. "Father, teach me to become heir." Weeks turned to months. Ferdinand insisted on scheduled visitations, prepared like military campaigns. Astrologers calculated auspicious minutes. Surgeons injected laudanum behind tapestry screens. I waited in the antechamber, beads slipping through my fingers, though every avenue felt useless. Isabel endured by severing soul from body. Her eyes drifted somewhere beyond the vaulted ceiling even as she lay beneath him. In the hush afterward, she would ask me if angels could faint. I answered in riddles, because the truth that God wept alongside us might have broken her fragile calm. Ferdinand's frustration fermented into cruelty. He accused Isabel of deliberate sterility, claimed her whimpers poisoned the air. He ordered her meals salted with rare herbs said to quicken conception, then berated her when they made her retch. Once he commanded the palace locksmith to reduce every Quijono servant, he swore, would spy on his struggle again. As chisels rang through corridors, dust-coated marble saints, I wondered whether those statues envied stone hearts. Confession became a revolving door of desperation. Ferdinand knelt, sweating, to recount visions in which Maria Antonia's ghost mocked his failures. Then rose without penance, too proud to finish a prayer. Isabel followed, voice athread, pleading for permission to refuse the royal bed. Canon. Law allowed separation for grave harm, yet to declare such publicly would crack the facade propping Spain's throne. My silence yoked me to their tragedy, became custodian of screams no chronicle would record. Rumor sprouted nevertheless. Madrid's taverns filled with jokes about the king's Moorish club and bets on how long the new queen would last. Pamphlets sketched caricatures of a throne balanced on a single grotesque limb. One reached the palace kitchens, and a scullion was hanged as example. I absolved the boy moments before the rope snapped. His only sin had been laughter. Outside these walls, the world convulsed. Napoleon's shadow lengthened across Europe, and Spaniards who once toasted enlightenment now sharpened knives against French advance. Yet in council, Ferdinand spoke only of lineage, demanding funds for alchemists, not artillery. When ministers warned of empty coffers, he dismissed them. An heir will refill Spain's purse. Even gold, it seemed, depended on his bedroom. Isabel's health withered. Phantom pregnancies teased her belly softly rounded, then sank back, leaving her sobbing against chapel pillars. Physicians blamed hysteria. I blamed hopelessness. Finally, on a bleak January morning, she collapsed after Mass. Her last confession leaked from cracked lips. She feared hell not for sins of flesh, but for wishing nightly that God would end her misery. She died hours later, skin translucent as wax. Ferdinand ordered an autopsy to search for hidden poisons of Portuguese design. Finding none, he declared the corpse evidence of treachery and had 2 of her ladies flogged. Grief might humble ordinary men. For Ferdinand, it forged a darker resolve. He toured Europe's courts with emissaries' letters, advertising not love but opportunity. Marry him and become mother of Spain. Only Saxony, deep in debt, accepted the bargain. Maria Josepha arrived wielding practicality like armor. She requested separate chambers, her own surgeon, and nightly records of the king's health. At first, Ferdinand agreed. Hope dulled his suspicion. She approached intimacy as experiment. Diagrams of angles and pulleys decorated her dressing table. She mixed German tinctures promising pliability. Their encounters resembled surgical trials measure, attempt, record, adjust. In confession, she admitted no fear, only frustration that the specimen refuses all known methods of insertion without damage. I almost choked on the clinical chill of her words, yet admired her will to survive. For 6 years, the ledger marked failure after failure. Spain, meanwhile, bled colonies. Buenos Aires, Bogota, Caracas, rebel banner, another artery severed while the king dissected his own despair. When priests petitioned for aid, to earthquake. Victims in Caracas, Ferdinand scoffed, claiming the disaster punishment for colonial insolence. I wrote him a letter never sent asking whether God would soon punish Madrid for sins committed in its royal bed. Then, astonishingly, Maria Josepha conceived. The court erupted as if Gabriel's trumpet had sounded. Ferdinand paraded relics, ordered Te Deums in every parish, fasted 1 day a week in gratitude. Maria Josephae, ever methodical, confined herself to bed, calculating heartbeats against chance. Her diarische allowed me to recharted hope, like a fragile bloom. She asked me once whether I believed a child born of fear could grow untainted. I answered that grace sometimes sprouts in poisoned fields, but grace did not sprout. In the 7th month, her womb rebelled. The night she bled, thunder cracked over Madrid, and torches jittered along the gallery as physicians rushed in. Ferdinand demanded to witness the birth. He gripped my sleeve so hard, my nails cut flesh. A daughter emerged too soon, lungs whistling like broken flutes. She died before sunrise. Maria Josepha followed weeks later, infection gnawing through her. On her deathbed, she confessed only one sin: pride in believing science could tame fate. The double coffin stood beneath the palace dome, candles quavering around it. Ferdinand screamed at God, slashed the hangings, fired half the medical staff. He kept the tiny corpse in a crystal case beside his pillow for 3 days, praying for resurrection. When decay set in, he blamed French physicians for sabotaging. The miracle. Spain's patience frayed. Peasants muttered that the king's curse drained the harvest. Merchants cursed taxes funding foreign quacks. Rebels in the Americas declared independence, using tales of royal depravity as rallying cries. I preached unity from the pulpit, but heard my voice echo hollow. A shepherd once pressed 2 pesos into my palm, begging me to bless his fields against the king's evil eye. I realized then that Ferdinand's tragedy had seeped into the very soil of Castile. Yet he pursued a 4th marriage, as though repeating the ritual might rewrite destiny. Maria Cristina of Naples arrived already heavy. With child court gossip concluded, the pregnancy was payment for her consent. Ferdinand chose denial over doubt. Providence has granted me seed by indirect route, he declared. The girl born 9 months later, Isabella, became both his obsession and his torment. He would cradle her in one breath, then thrust her at me in the next, demanding I verify resemblance to Bourbon ancestors. And so my confessional filled with newer voices. A Neapolitan queen whispering terror of spy holes drilled through walls. Nurses trembling because the king tasted Isabella's porridge to test for poison, then forced them to finish the bowl. Guards confessing exhaustion from night raids when Ferdinand burst into corridors searching for imaginary assassins. Sin multiplied like mildew in dark corners, while I sworn to silence mop spiritual blood with absolution now. As I dip my quill, I feel the kingdom tilting. Don Carlos rallies supporters who chant that a man, not a girl, must rule. Liberals print pamphlets demanding parliament over pedigree. And I, keeper of secrets, know the true heart of our crisis beats in a single, twisted body laid beneath marble, just 2 corridors away. Will history judge me complicit? Perhaps. Yet I record every confession, every scream, every potion bottle. Because someday a scholar, a young queen may read and choose a different path. If truth can survive vaults of shame, maybe Spain can too. I pray the parchment endures longer than the flesh that damned us. I did not expect to meet Maria Cristina in the confessional so soon after she arrived, yet the young queen barely beyond. Girlhood slipped into my booth the very week her trunks were still being unpacked. Her voice sounded like brittle glass. She confessed that the child in her belly was already stirring and that Ferdinand, blinded by relief, refused to count, backward on his fingers. I offered what comfort I could, but she knew the truth. Concealment had become the currency of her survival. I listened while she prayed that the child, whatever its origin, might placate a nation starving for hope. When she left, the incense still swirled in her wake, carrying the faint scent of Neapolitan citrus, bright, fragile, out of place in these gloom-stained corridors. Months later, Isabella was born beneath crimson canopies and the roar of ceremonial Canon Ferdinand held the infant as though she were proof that Providence had finally bent to his will. He paraded through the palace, waving a tiny hand still curled like a seashell. Courtiers cheered, mouths stretched into smiles they dared not relax, because they saw, as I did, the flicker in his eyes that asked, "Does she resemble me?" That question became his moon. It pulled at every tide of his mind. In the nursery, Ferdinand inspected the child with the intensity of a scholar poring over scripture. He compared her dimples to Bourbon portraits, her nails to Habsburg miniatures. When an artist delivered the first likeness, he demanded alteration shadows under the brow, a narrower chin-nudging ink toward imagined kinship. I witnessed these sessions, heart-nodding, for each adjustment seemed less about love and more about erasing doubt. He kissed the picture more than he kissed the child. Maria Christina endured the scrutiny like a statue exposed to weather. She rarely cried, at least not where anyone could see, but her hands seldom stopped trembling. Her letters to Naples passed through 6 layers of eyes before reaching port. Every word she wrote might return to condemn her. She learned to sprinkle scripture through her sentences, hoping holy phrases would dissuade Ferdinand's spies from prying deeper. It seldom worked. The king's fear was a wildfire, jumping every firebreak. Each night he crept through hidden passages, pressing his gaze to peepholes drilled into her chambers. I once caught sight of his Aja single desperate orb blinking in candlelight. While the queen dozed, exhausted from nursing, he turned to me, unashamed, and whispered, "Even a shepherd watches over sheep, Father." I dared not reply that shepherds trust their flock. He wielded poison-tasting rituals like cudgels. A dozen servants sampled every dish. They waited a full half-hour before Isabella could eat. One footman, just 16, vomited from nerves and was hauled away in chains for simulating poison. I absolved the boy at dawn, his face streaked with terror, and wondered how many souls would drown in suspicion before the king's tide receded. Outside, Spain cracked. Carlist rebels gathered beneath church spires, arguing that a woman could never rule. Liberal pamphlets depicted Ferdinand as a lecherous ghoul clutching an infant not his own. Grain prices soared. Gans prowled the royal road within sight of the capital. In council, ministers begged for decrees on taxation and security. Ferdinand waved them aside, obsessed instead with genealogists who promised charts proving an unbroken male line stretching from Visigoth kings straight into Isabella's cradle. Doubt be damned, confession became my daily crucible. Guards whispered of forged birth certificates. Midwives regretted the slight variances they recorded in birth. Weight numbers Ferdinand revisited like a mathematician hunting for errors. The queen confessed that she feared her heartbeat might reveal secrets if he pressed his ear to her chest. I reminded her that God alone could read hearts. She smiled, thin, resigned. "His Majesty tries anyway," she said. Winter of 1832 arrived, icier than any I recall. Snow muffled the city. Inside, Ferdinand's panic grew louder. He ordered the corridors heated to stifling warmth, believing cold encouraged assassins to venture near. The futility of fire-soaked halls and frosted windows seemed lost on him. At mid-advent, he barged into Maria Christina's apartments, flanked by physicians, demanding she undergo examination for contact poisons oils that might seep through skin. The queen endured the humiliation in silence, but afterward, she knelt in the chapel until her knees bled, begging Mary for endurance. I placed a cloak around her shoulders, feeling the tremors beneath. Soon Ferdinand's body betrayed him faster than courtiers ever could. Gout swelled his joints. Sweet rot of unchecked diabetes left a sour smell in every room he occupied. He refused to admit weakness, ordered tailor after tailor to let seams out, then claimed the clothiers conspired to mock him with tight garments. At council, he rambled, voice slurring between demands for extra guards and accusations that invisible French agents plotted from the palace kitchens. On a stifling September afternoon in 1833, I was summoned to his bedside. Sweat glistened on his brow, despite autumn chills seeping through shutter cracks. He clutched my wrist with astonishing strength. Isabella must wear the crown, he rasped, even if Spain burns. I told him kings should pray for souls, not subsidies of flame. But he had drifted back to dreams calling dead wives by name, bargaining with them for sons he never held. 3 nights later, Ferdinand died, while the great clock in the courtyard told Compline. Silence fell so heavy, I imagined I could hear the dying beat of his monstrous heart still echoing in the rafters. Maria Cristina collapsed into a chair, grief and relief braided into one strangling vine. I blessed the body, though words caught. In my throat, the same lips that uttered absolution had heard. No prayer could wash away. The royal physicians arrived at dawn with copper instruments and linen shrouds. Their leader, Dr. Baez, unfolded a written directive purportedly sealed by Ferdinand himself. Certain exceptional anatomical samples were to be preserved for further enlightenment of medical science and assurance of dynastic vigor. None doubted what that euphemism meant. The surgeons worked behind drapes while I recited psalms, each verse a shield against the scraping of bone saw and the clink of glass jars being filled. When the drapes parted, a vessel the length of my forearm lay cradled in velvet, pale flesh swirling in cloudy spirit. A hush blanketed the room. One assistant crossed himself so quickly his knuckles cracked. Another stared as though confronted by Leviathan's tooth. They turned to Miss Silent. Plea for explanation. I could only murmur, "Vanity of vanities. All is vanity." The jar vanished into a cedar chest bound for the private archives. Officially, Ferdinand's heart would rest in El Escorial beside princes and martyrs. Yet this relic of shame traveled deeper underground, an inverse relic, mocking every saintly bone encased in gold above the funeral cortege moved through Madrid under black banners. Crowds wept, cheered, or spat, depending on which broadside they last read. I walked just behind the casket, incense thurible swinging in my hand. The smoke curled around me like memory's Maria Antonia's laudanum sweet breath, Isabel's midnight. Sobs, Maria Josepha's cool clinical questions, Maria Christina's silent terrors. All that pain processed down the Kale Mayor, dressed in sable, at the crypt door. I felt Isabella's tiny fingers tug my cassock. She stared up, eyes wide, untainted by politics, by biology, by rumor. In that moment, I understood my final duty. Secrets, once confessed, beg for penance. Spain's penance would be truth, even if truth scorched her tongue. After the tomb was sealed, I returned to my desk and began copying every page of notes I had hidden these many years every midnight. Confession, every medical prescription, every threat disguised as prayer. I sealed the copies beneath the sacristy floor, where future generations might read and understand how a throne can be eaten from within. By a single fear, some nights I wonder whether the jar still floats in its dark vault, or whether time and mildew have dissolved the flesh into formless memory. Either way, the lesson remains. Power built on secrecy must eventually face light, and when it does, no velvet curtain nor silver jar can save it. Isabella now toddles through echoing halls, her laughter a fragile chime trying to outrain ghosts. The Carlists march under banners of tradition, liberals under banners of liberty, but neither faction yet grasps that the kingdom's deepest wound is spiritual. I kneel each dawn, praying that the sins of the father do not seed another harvest of despair. If these pages survive, let them stand as proof that a priest may carry both mercy and witness in the same weary heart. I could not stop the suffering, but I can name it, and names have power. I entrust that power to whoever reads these words long after candles, gutter, and marble cracks. May they choose compassion where Ferdinand chose fear. And may Spain one day breathe without the stench of secrets embalmed in alcohol and silence. The first winter after Ferdinand's burial arrived like a reluctant confession, each dawn peeling another layer of frailty from the kingdom he left behind. Madrid's streets filled with rumors as quickly as they emptied of bread. I watched Isabella barely walking stumble across the marble floor of the Hall of Columns while ministers bowed lower than gravity required. They did not bend to a child. They bent to uncertainty, to the vacuum a tyrant's death always creates. Maria Cristina, now regent by decree, wore widow's black that swallowed her slight frame. But her eyes, once dulled by fear, had begun to sharpen. She understood that pity would invite predation, and so she mastered the art Ferdinand never could, smiling without blinking. One January morning, she summoned me to the small chapel adjacent to her chambers. Snow slid from stained glass saints in pale slivers of light. The queen knelt before the altar, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles blanched. She asked me if absolution could extend to an entire people. I replied that grace is offered to nations, the same way it is to souls. They must first name their sins aloud. Her lips quivered. Spain's tongue is tied, she whispered, and its knots bear my husband's seal. I wanted to say she was free to cut those knots, but the words caught like fish in a net. My vocation forbade me to steer the ship of state. All I could do was remind her that truth, once spoken, seldom remains caged. Within weeks, the first pamphlets of the Carlist cause fluttered through taverns and marketplaces. Don Carlos, Ferdinand's brother, declared that a kingdom could not be steered by a girl wearing swaddling cloth. He wrapped his ambition in banners of tradition and marched north, where mountain winds favored revolt. Soldiers who had once sworn loyalty to Ferdinand now pledged themselves to slogans older than their muskets. In confession, I heard young conscripts say they fought for God, King, and the old laws. But the tremor in their voices told me they fought mostly for a sense of certainty. Ferdinand's reign had starved them of that more than any famine ever could. Maria Cristina answered with decrees written in firm, unornamented script her own hand. Not a secretary's. She promised councils of regency, the revival of the Cortes. Modest concessions to liberal minds, yet each parchment bore invisible fingerprints of fear. Ferdinand's spies still lurked, unsure whose coin to accept next. I felt their eyes during Mass, weighing my homilies for treason disguised as theology. It astonished me how quickly a kingdom could pivot from worshipping a king's shadow to policing one another's. Isabella toddled through this turmoil, largely unaware. She chased dust motes that sparkled in shafts of sun and laughed when I let her ring the sacristy bell with chubby fists. But even her nursery was not free of the old king's hauntings. One afternoon, I discovered a faded portrait of Ferdinand propped behind her cradle, eyes retouched to look benevolent. A governess confessed that palace staff believed the child would sleep more soundly if her father's image stood guard. I removed the painting after nightfall, replacing it with a crucifix small enough for Isabella's gaze, yet large enough to promise a gentler watch. Outside the palace walls, war germinated. Carlist guerrillas ambushed supply trains. Liberal volunteers formed militias under tricolor banners. Every confession I heard seemed laced with gunpowder. A mother praying her son's rifle might jam before it killed. A blacksmith forging horseshoes for whichever rider paid fastest. A nun who smuggled leaflets in her habit sleeves. I wondered whether Ferdinand, in death, sensed the unraveling of the tapestry he had stretched so taut in life. Perhaps the jar in the vault rattled each time muskets cracked in Navarre. In March, Maria Christina convened a secret council of bishops, seeking the church's blessing for her regency. I was invited only as confessor, not counselor, yet gossip traveled faster than summonses. Some prelates argued that supporting a queen regent contradicted centuries of Salic custom. Others countered that abandoning an infant queen would fracture Spain beyond repair. The debate incensed Cardinal Tavera so greatly that he pounded the table and split a wine goblet, crimson spilling like stigmata across parchment. When the shouting ceased, consensus emerged as reluctantly as spring buds. The church would stand with Isabella only because schism looked uglier than compromise. The following Sunday, one preached from the cathedral pulpit. The nave overflowed with soldiers in mismatched uniforms, merchants clutching ledgers no longer balanced, widows veiled in gray. I spoke of King Solomon, whose wisdom appeared only after he asked for it. God grants discernment, I said, to those humble enough to know they lack it. Heads bowed, but faces remained wary. Sermons, they knew, could not mend bread prices or patch bullet wounds. Rumors of Ferdinand's preserved shame resurfaced amid the chaos, whispered by tavern keepers to sell more ale, printed by pamphleteers hungry for scandal. Some claimed Don Carlos promised to exhume the jar and smash it before the crowd, symbol of ending the Bourbon curse. Others insisted Maria Christina planned to present it to the Cortes as proof of the old king's madness, thereby justifying reforms. At first, I dismissed these tales, but soon couriers arrived from provincial governors requesting ecclesiastical verification. They wanted the church to confirm or deny the relic's existence. I realized then that Ferdinand's ghost wielded more leverage than any living prince. One moonless night, I descended to the archive vault beneath the Palisan ossuary of secrets where scrolls lay like bones, each labeled with a reign and a sin. The cedar chest sat where I last saw it, twin iron locks stamped with bourbon lilies. My key opened neither. I traced the lid, half expecting it to throb with heartbeat. Nothing, yet the chill that seeped through my fingertips felt like admonition. Some reliquaries hold not holiness, but warning, as conflict worsened. Refugees clogged Madrid's gates, seeking sanctuary long since spent. Pestilence followed on their heels, typhus, dysentery, fevers that devoured children faster than any musket ball. Hospitals overflowed. Convents converted refectories into sick wards. I moved among the cots, administering last rites until my voice rasped. Each dying soldier seemed younger than the last. I remembered Ferdinand's demand that Isabella inherit even if Spain burns, and I feared his prophecy took form in every pyre outside the city walls. Then came the day Carlist. Forces breached the Manzanares, smoke curling over rooftops like a black psalm. Cannon thunder shook the stained glass of my confessional. I escorted Maria, Christina, and Isabella to the chapel cellar, where limestone, damp, and candlelight fought for dominion. The queen pressed a jade rosary to her lips and whispered, "Will God forgive my silence?" I answered with a question of my own. Will Spain survive another lie? She did not weep. Tears were luxuries reserved for calmer hours. Instead, she clutched her daughter to her chest, as if flesh alone could shield royalty from lead. Miraculously, liberal reinforcements arrived before dawn, repelling the assault. The city exhaled smoke and relief in equal measure. Yet the near disaster galvanized public sentiment. They demanded transparency, accountability, something cleaner than dynastic chess. Newspapers once afraid to print Ferdinand's name alongside the word deformity now splashed caricatures of his grotesque legacy across front pages. The jar became myth. The myth became rallying cry. Smash the vessel, smash the cycle. Faced with mounting pressure, Maria Christina summoned me once more. Her cheeks bore new creases, etched by sleepless nights and the weight of secrets. "It is time," she said, "for Spain to see what haunted its throne." My breath caught. She intended a public reckoning and unveiling of the relic, the confessions, the hidden corridors, everything. I cautioned that truth can ignite as readily as it illuminates. She nodded, reminding me that parchment already burned across battlefields. At least this flame she could direct. Preparations began for a cortes extraordinary. Representatives from shattered provinces would gather, hear the full account, and decide whether monarchy could be salvaged or must be recast. I spent nights copying my secret transcripts, abbreviating names of innocents, expanding on deeds of the guilty. With each dip of quill, relief warred with dread. I was a priest, yet I had become historian, witness, reluctant midwife to a nation's confession, as spring unfurled. Almond blossoms dusted palace gardens like fresh snow-white petals replacing the ash of siege fires. I imagined Spain herself pausing, poised between decay and renewal. In a quiet corner of the cloister, Isabella toddled after falling petals, laughing when they melted on her tongue. I prayed that she might grow in a land where laughter need not hide behind curtains. The day before the Cortes convened, I returned to the vault, accompanied by 2 palace guards and the royal archivist. Together we lifted the cedar chest, carried it through echoing halls, and set it before the assembly chamber's locked doors. Inside, deputies' voices mingled with the creak of benches and the rustle of agendas. Outside, crowds gathered, uncertain whether they had come to witness coronation or autopsy. I rested my hand atop the lid, feeling neither pulse nor predominantly the weight of culmination. Tomorrow, Spain would open the chest. Whether they found shriveled flesh or only rumor embalmed in cedar, the revelation would close one wound even as it exposed another. I whispered a final absolution, not for Ferdinand his reckoning, lay in. Hands beyond mine, but for a people forced to swallow lies thicker than blood. The prayer drifted upward, slipped through vaulting arches, and joined the first swallows returning from Africa. Stitching new patterns across a sky washed clean. By storm, I stepped back, candle guttering in my grasp. Somewhere behind me, Isabella called for her nurse, voice bright, insistent, alive. I followed that sound through corridors no longer lit by fear, trusting that a child's laughter might guide even the weariest. Confessor toward dawn, the Cortes extraordinary convened on the first Thursday after Easter, when the sun inched high. Enough to gild the palace facades, but not yet warm enough to soften the chill of winter memories. Deputies from Catalonia to Castile, Aragon to Andalusia, filled the chamber with a patchwork of accents and anxieties. Faded veterans in threadbare uniforms brushed shoulders with powdered aristocrats. Friars argued scripture beside ink-smudged liberal pamphleteers. They had all come to witness Spain's reckoning. If rumor proved true, to stare down the very relic that had haunted a nation's conscience. I arrived at dawn to bless the hall. Incense mingled with candle grease as I murmured the litany of the saints, hoping ancient syllables might quiet modern tempers. Yet every echo of my chant seemed to ricochet off the cedar chest stationed before the speaker's rostrum. Guards flanked it, halberds crossed like an iron noose. The lid's polished grain reflected torchlight in patterns eerily reminiscent of veins. It looked less like a box of wood than a living organ waiting to beat. Maria Cristina entered in sober violet, the color of penance. She held Isabella by the hand, more symbol than child today. When the Queen Regent took her seat, murmurs rippled through the benches. Some sighed with relief that royalty still bothered to appear. Others hissed. Seeing only the shadow of Ferdinand cast behind her, the session opened with prayers, then with protocol. Names were read, credentials verified, quills scratched. The monotony felt deliberate stalling tactics to keep curiosity simmering on low flame. At last, the speaker rose, voice quavering like a novice monk at first mass. Your Majesties, most illustrious deputies, we gather to confront truths long entombed. His finger drifted to the chest. Certain artifacts remain sealed by royal decree. Her Majesty consents that we unseal them, so judgment may be informed by fact, not by tavern tales, gasps, coughs, a chair scraping stone. I watched Dan Esteban de Rojas Arch, conservative. Proud heir to Visigoth, lock-clutch his rosary so tightly the beads bit into flesh. Across the aisle, Dona Lucia Valderraza, fierce liberal from Cadiz, scribbled notes, lips curled in anticipation. Two worlds preparing to see the same ghost, yet already drafting opposing exorcisms. Keys clanked. A steward lifted the first lock, then the second. He hesitated a silent plea for absolution before drawing back the lid. The room inhaled as one. Inside lay a smaller jar than gossip had promised. No grand reliquary encrusted with gems, only a stout vessel of thick glass sealed with aging wax. The liquid within, once clear alcohol, had darkened to tea-stain hues. Something pale and twisted floated like a drowned root. No label, no royal crest, just anonymous flesh suspended in amber silence. For a heartbeat, the chamber sat mute. Then, uproar. Some deputies leaped to their feet, demanding the jar be smashed. Others cried sacrilege at the thought. Engineers stood on tiptoe to inspect morphology. Priests shielded their eyes, uncertain if reverence or revulsion was holier. Isabella whimpered, confused by adult fury hurled over a jar she could not even see from her height. The speaker banged his gavel until splinters flew. Order. By God's mercy. Order. He motioned to a court physician, Dr. Herrera, silver-haired, steady of hand, who stepped forward. Stethoscope dangling like an ironic ornament. He produced a sealed affidavit, the signatures of Ferdinand's embalmers. The date of extraction, a clinical description verifying that the specimen was indeed the royal organ. Preserved at His Catholic Majesty's explicit instruction, a collective shudder rippled across rows. Documentation transformed rumor into indelible record. I felt a strange loosening in my chest, equal parts vindication and dread. Spain could no longer claim ignorance, but what would knowledge demand in return? Debate erupted. Conservatives argued that exposing the relic served only to humiliate the monarchy, further weakening Spain amidst foreign vultures. Liberals countered that secrecy had already crippled the nation. Only daylight could disinfect. Some moderates proposed reinterring the jar in consecrated ground, a symbolic burial of past sins. Yet radicals insisted the people must witness it parade. The jar through plazas as proof of tyranny's grotesque cost. Amid the cacophony, I was summoned to speak. My cassock rustled as I climbed the dais, pulse hammering like a bell for vespers. I faced the deputies, the jar glinting behind me, and inhaled the mixed scent of sweat, parchment, and old fear. I stand. I began, voice steadier than I felt. Not as judge, nor as physician, but as confessor-keeper of secrets, too heavy for those who bore them. For years, I heard the whispers of queens whose bodies broke beneath a burden they could not name aloud. I listened to a king who mistook domination for dignity. Every soul I absolved left a sliver of sorrow lodged in mine. Silence thickened. Even hardened war veterans leaned in. This jar, I continued, tapping the glass, is not merely flesh. It is the harvest of unchecked power, of courts that silenced conscience for protocol, of a people who feared rumor more than injustice. Smash it, and shards will cut new wounds. Worship it, and you enthrone deformity anew. Instead, I paused, searching faces look at it, understand the pain it represents, then choose a future that will never birth such relics again. For a moment, no one moved. Then, from the rearmost bench, a lone deputy began to clap tentative. Respectful. Applause spread, hesitant but growing until the hall resonated like cathedral domes during Easter Gloria. Not celebration, but acknowledgement. A communal nod that truth had been seen and must be met. The speaker declared a recess for reflection before formal resolutions. As benches emptied, I felt Maria Christina's gaze upon me. She mouthed a simple, "Thank you," though tears clogged the syllables. She gathered Isabella and slipped out a side door. Mother shielding daughter from the tides she herself had loosed. And the courtyard deputies mingled in clusters. Their debates now hushed, almost tender. Some sketched proposals for a limited constitutional monarchy. Others envisioned broader reforms: education, land redistribution, the pruning of the Inquisition. Even those still loyal to Bourbon absolutism seemed shaken, as though the jar had cracked their certainty wider than any liberal pamphlet could dot. Night approached. Torches flickered against frescoed walls. Don Carlos's envoys prowled the periphery, gauging which hearts might still be swayed toward rebellion. Yet the mood favored neither blind tradition nor reckless revolt. It leaned toward something rarer. Sobriety. Back in my chamber, I opened the ledger where I recorded confessions anonymized beyond recognition, yet alive with humanity. I added a final entry. Today, Spain confessed. I closed the book, knowing absolution was never a single act, but a practice one the nation must renew daily. 3 days later, the Cortes passed the Charter of Regnal Responsibility. It affirmed Isabella's succession, but bound the crown to parliamentary council, abolished secret tribunals, and mandated that any royal health issues be overseen by a civilian medical board rather than clandestine palace surgeons. The jar, by joint decree, was placed in a sealed reliquary beneath the chapel floor, not hidden, but accessible to future historians under ecclesiastical and civic supervision. Its plaque read, Memoria Docet, Memory Teaches. I attended the entombment. We sang the Miserere, and as the stone slab slid shut, I felt a hush settle over the chapel like fresh snow covering battle scars. Not erasure, but quiet. Weeks later, I strolled the Alameda Park. Soldiers shared benches with artisans, debating tariffs instead of lineage. Street children chased kites shaped like doves. A newspaper vendor hawked broadsheets praising the Cortes, while another critiqued it both free to shout. The air smelled of chestnut blossoms rather than gunpowder. Spain, still wounded, had taken its first unshackled breath. From the palace balcony, Isabella waved a pudgy hand at passersby, who might one day be her subjects rather than her prisoners. Maria Cristina stood behind her, no longer a figure of siege, but of stewardship. Their silhouettes framed by spring. Lights seemed less like echoes of Ferdinand and more like notes of an unwritten hymn. I touched my rosary, grateful. Confession is never the end. It is the doorway. In Spain, jar sealed in stone had stepped through. Twilight seeped across Madrid. Like diluted ink, staining rooftops, violet while lanterns sparked to life in crooked lanes. A warm breeze drifted through San Isidro's belfry and ruffled my cassock as I stepped onto the balcony that overlooked the city's sprawl. I had stood here many evenings, tallying sins whispered in the dark and prayers muttered at dawn. Yet, tonight the air felt change lighter, if still fragile, as though the whole capital had exhaled after years of holding its breath. Below, the Plaza Mayor thrummed with cautious celebration. Bakers handed out day-old bread that might once have been hoarded. A trio of street musicians coaxed half-remembered hatas from battered guitars, their melody wobbling but sincere. I watched a gray-haired veteran lift his grandson onto his shoulders, so the boy could glimpse the temporary banner hung across a tavern's lintel corazon. Why Memoria, Heart, and Memory. Spain, always fond of slogans, had stumbled upon one that felt almost medicinal. Inside my chambers, a travel satchel rested on the desk. Its leather was cracked from decades of pilgrimage between confessionals, yet the clasp still clicked shut with determined purpose. Tomorrow, I would leave the palace for the Benedictine retreat at Silos. Sent by my archbishop to decompress, to pray, to allow the fever dream of court intrigue to sweat out of my pores. I had agreed, but a knot of reluctance tugged in my gut. Shepherds are meant to remain among their flocks, especially when wolves still prowled the tree line. A soft rap at my door broke the reverie. When I opened it, young Isabella stood there, cheeks flushed from climbing to flights of stair without escort. The Princess Snow, the future queen, clutched a thin candle guttering wax onto her knuckles. Behind her, Maria Christina's lady-in-waiting, hovered breathless from pursuit. "Father," Isabella whispered, "may I speak with you?" Her voice trembled. Not from fear, but from the burden of 1,000 expectations suddenly resting on 12-year-old shoulders. I ushered her in, dismissed the attendant, and settled the candle onto the mantel. Its flame cast quivering halos on the stucco walls, reminding me how uncertain light can seem more truthful than the midday sun. "What troubles you, child?" She straightened, schooling herself in the posture tutors had drilled since infancy. "The court test vote is final. Say I will reign when mother's regency ends." A pause. "But Don Carlos has left for Navarre and takes priests with him who claim only he can protect the faith. Some of my own cousins call me a usurper. I could have offered platitudes, yet honesty felt kinder. Civil war looms. Yes, men will. Wrap ambition in scripture and call it piety. Others will drape greed in patriotism and shout liberty while emptying treasuries. Your task is to hear every voice without letting any single one drown your conscience." She studied me with eyes that held more dusk than dawn, and the jar father. The deputies entombed it, but people still speak. They laugh at my bloodline, or pity it. How do I rule when my very inheritance is a punchline? There it was, the ache no crown could cushion. I drew a breath, scented by beeswax and distant. Jasmine, relics, teach by remaining silent. The jar cannot defend itself, cannot reshape rumor. Nor can you silence every whisper. You can only live so that future whispers find no purchase. Her shoulders relaxed, yet a quiver of uncertainty lingered. Will God forgive my grandfather? I recalled Ferdinand's tear-blurred confession in that stifling chapel months before his death. The stench of medicinal salves, the cracked bravado, the solitary tear that finally fell when he spoke of the unborn children he had never held. Mercy is God's favorite miracle, I told her. But repentance is the door through which it enters. We entrust his judgment to eternity. We concern ourselves with the living. Isabella nodded, then surprised me by reaching into her bodice to pull out a folded parchment. "For you," she said. "Ha! I have drafted a decree, but I lack the courage to present it. It appoints you protector of the royal charities with authority to audit orphanages, almshouses, and veterans' wards. Mother says it is unconventional to give such power to a priest." She bit her lip. "Yet it feels necessary." I unfolded the paper. Her quill marks were tentative, yet the intent bold. Transparency, oversight, funding mechanisms gleaned from new tariffs on luxury imports rather than grain. The princess had crafted an antidote to the very poisons that had rotted her forebears' reigns. I felt tears heat my eyes. "Why me?" I asked. "Because you listened," she said simply. To my grandfather, to the deputies, to the kitchen maid crying behind the basilica after her confession. Spain needs ears more than swords right now. The simplicity struck like a bell. I dipped my pen, signed the parchment as witness, and sealed it with the small ring Hieronymite monks once gave me for mediating a land dispute. Then Spain shall have them, I said. When Isabella left, candle in hand, I returned to the balcony. Night had settled, but the city glimmered with scattered lanterns, each a tiny rebellion against darkness. Somewhere beyond the horizon, dawn. Carlos rallied supporters beneath banners stitched with archaic heraldry, and French diplomats penned cautious letters, and British merchants calculated profit margins on Spanish instability. Battles would come, Carlist sieges, cholera outbreaks, harvest failures. Yet the seed of accountability had been planted, watered by confession, fertilized by truth preserved in glass. I thought of the jar beneath the chapel floor. In my mind's eye, it glowed faintly, not with horror now, but with utility, like a lighthouse. Warning ships from ragged rocks. Memory teaches. Spain's new generation would not forget. The next dawn, I delayed my departure to silos. Instead, I walked to the plaza where relief kitchens had begun serving broth financed by the region's freshly minted decree. Steam rose in hopeful spirals. I ladled soup beside a corporal missing, 2 fingers to Napoleonic grape shot, and a Moorish convert who quoted St. Augustine while sprinkling salt. Children queued, bowls in hand, their laughter weaving through the air like birdsong. Halfway through the morning, a courier arrived, dusty from overnight ride. He delivered a parchment sealed with the Queen Regent's crest. My appointment ratified. Countersigned by the Cortes, effective immediately. Ink still wet, authority still absurdly fragile. I folded it into my breast pocket and kept ladling soup. Power, I had learned, is safest when diluted in service. Weeks slid into months. Spring perfumes yielded to the baked earth scent of Castilian. Summer Carlist skirmishes flared in the north, but Madrid held its nerve. I traveled from Toledo to Valencia, inspecting hospices, replacing corrupt stewards with widows who understood hunger better than greed, channeling excess silver buttons from courtiers' wardrobes into blankets for mountain orphans. Each night, I wrote letters to Isabella detailing victories and failures alike. She responded with questions sharper than any bishop's counsel. One evening in Zaragoza, after blessing a convalescent ward rattled by typhus, I opened my journal and found the page where I had once penned, "Today Spain confessed." Beneath it, I added a new line. Today, Spain performed penance, not flogging. Nor ashes, but bread shared without ledger. Thunder rumbled beyond the Ebro, as if to punctuate the thought. I closed the journal, whispered a prayer for soldiers, huddled in distant trenches, and allowed myself a small smile. Absolution is never earned in a single act, but step by halting step. A priest learns to recognize grace in motion, a queen who signs decrees against her own comfort, a parliament that chooses light over laughter, a child queen who asks whether God forgives monsters and then vows to build hospitals for their victims. Some nights, I still wake sweating, haunted by screams echoing down marble corridors, by the slick crimson of blood-streaked sheets, by the glassy stare of women who mistook opium for escape. Trauma does not vanish. It mutates, whispers, waits. Yet each dawn that Spain rises without gag orders or secret torturers, the past loses a little more power. I know civil strife will test these fragile reforms. Perhaps Isabella will falter. Perhaps opportunists will twist new laws into old shackles. Human nature is stubborn and sin's vocabulary vast. But confession, when genuine, leaves an imprint even heresy cannot fully erase. I seal this final recollection with a note to whoever finds these pages long after my bones return to dust. Remember the jar beneath the chapel? Let it remind you that Bodhisattva nations warp under secrecy's weight. Let it caution every counselor who tempts a ruler with lies dressed as flattery. And let it embolden each soul who dares unlock rusted lids so the stench may escape, and healing air may enter. For now, I pack the satchel once more. Silos still waits, its cloisters humming with chanted psalms. I will go, pray, and perhaps learn to sleep through the night again. Yet I depart, knowing that confession has breathed. Outside the confessional at last, that Spain has touched its own wound and not recoiled. That is enough to steady an old priest's steps along the dusty road toward whatever mercy tomorrow holds. Summer passed, and with it the first fragile calm. Yet clouds rose again over Spain, darker this time, thick with gunpowder and prophecy. I spent those months on the road. Toledo 1 week, Burgos the next, carrying the Queen's seal and an old leather Bible that smelled of pine sap. Wherever I arrived, I found the same twin hungers. People craved bread for their bellies and a reason to hope for their souls. We fed the first with barley loaves, bought by new tariffs. We fed the second with honest words spoken face to face. For a moment, it felt as though confession had spilled out of the booth and into the nation itself. But scenes, like seeds, sprout quickest in broken soil by early autumn. Banners of Don Carlos fluttered from Navarre's watchtowers. His clergy thundered that a girl could never wear Spain's crown without courting damnation. Pamphlets crossed. The Ebro tucked inside flour sacks. They called Isabella the bastard queen. They called men like me wolves in shepherd's clothes. Villages began choosing sides with bonfires. Red gold rags for the regent. Black cross pennants for the pretender. Smoke curled into heaven, carrying prayers and curses so tangled that not even the angels could tell them apart. I returned to Madrid to brief the regent. Maria Cristina listened from behind a desk layered with military memos. Candlelight haloed. Her brow, yet fatigue carved deep channels beneath her eyes. "Father," she asked, "does God punish children for the sins of their house?" "Only if they grow up and repeat them," I answered. "Your daughter still has a choice." The regent pressed her signet into hot wax and sealed an order mobilizing troops to the north. I saw her hand tremble, though her voice remained iron. "War is a confession shouted in cannons," she murmured. "May Spain survive the penance." That night I walked the palace corridor where Ferdinand's jar lay entombed beneath marble. Guards had draped the walls with new tapestries, battle scenes, heroic and sanitized. Yet I felt the weight of that. Hidden glass beneath my feet, a silent reminder that power multiplied by shame always finds a dark place to hide. I knelt, pressed my palm to the cold stone, and prayed that the kingdom above would not mirror the relic below. War came swift and bitter. Skirmishes bled into sieges. Rivers ran brown with mud and red with death. I rode with field chaplains, giving last rites in cherry orchards churned to sludge by artillery. We laid soldiers in trench-lined graves, Carlist and Cristino alike, and sang the Salve Regina until our throats cracked. On frosty mornings, I woke with frost in my beard and wondered how many boys had died because a long-dead king had feared impotence more than injustice. One dusk near Logroco, rebels overran a supply caravan. Among the wounded, I found Tomas, the Moorish convert who once salted broth beside me in Madrid. A musket ball had shattered his thigh. As I bound his wound, he smiled through pain. "Do not mourn, Padre," he said. "Even a cripple can kneel in prayer." He pressed a letter into my hand, one he had meant for Isabella. "Tell her Spain is worth every sacrifice, but never the old lies." I carried that note into the capital weeks later. The city teetered between fear and determination. Bread lines snaked past, shuttered shops. Yet in hospital wards funded by the Charities decree, nurses quoted scriptures about steadfast hearts while changing bandages that smelled of rot. When I presented Tom Ask's letter to the princess, she read it in silence, then tucked it beneath her sash. At 12, her eyes already carried the weight of borderlands she had never seen. "Father, Sfera," she said, "I will remember every name, friend and foe. Someday I must forgive them, but I will not forget." Winter sealed mountain passes, forcing armies into uneasy stillness. I seized the lull to journey at last to Silos, craving solitude the way a parched man craves rain. Snow muffled the cloister stones, and monks chanted in tones so pure they seemed carved from ice. For 3 weeks, I spoke almost nothing, letting silence sift through memory's clutter. In that hush, I finally faced my own secret dread. That I had become addicted to proximity to power, even righteous power. I knelt in the abbey crypt and confessed to the marble saints that heroism can be another form of vanity. Their stony faces offered no absolution, only the calm of those who outlived their reputations. A courier found me in the refectory on Epiphany morning. The regent's seal again, bearing grim news. Cholera in Valencia, mutiny near Bilbao, treasury. Funds siphoned by a colonel who fancied himself a future duke. The letter ended with a plea. Return. We need ears more than ever. I closed the parchment and realized my rest was over. Holiness, I decided, is not withdrawal, but return. So I rode south through valleys glazed with frost. Along the way, I brokered truces between shepherds and press gangs, arranged swaps of medicine for prisoners, baptized infants whose fathers wore opposing uniforms. Each act felt small, a candle stub in gusting wind. Yet night retreats one flame at a time. When I approached Madrid, spring had just begun to tease blossoms from almond branches. I paused atop a hill to gaze at the city. Its domes caught dawn, like hammered copper. Beneath those roofs, intrigue still fermented, but so did resolve. I thought of the jar again, sealed in darkness, powerless now to shame anyone unless we chose to repeat its story. Spain's future, fragile as a petal, rested not on relics, but on the daily discipline of truth. I dismounted, knelt in wet grass, and offered one more confession, not of sin this time, but of faith. I believed Spain could outgrow the shadow of a monstrous legacy. I believed Isabella could learn to wield mercy without surrendering justice. I believed wounds can become wisdom if we keep them clean and uncovered. When I reached the city gate, the sentry recognized me and saluted not a crisp military snap, but a simple tilt of the head, equal to equal. It was the smallest of honors, and the one I cherished most, for it meant the kingdom had begun to understand the lesson of every confession I had ever heard. Dignity is not bestowed by birth or stolen by scandal. It is chosen, day after day, in the light. I rode on. The bells of San Isidro welcoming me home. I've been back among the capital's rattling carriages and cinnamons, and its scented bakeries for scarcely a season when news arrived that Don Carlos's main force had collapsed outside Bilbao. The decisive blow belonged not to cavalry or cannon, but to hunger and wet gunpowder, the oldest allies of a long campaign. Evening bells declared the victory as triumphantly as they once told Ferdinand's coronations. Yet the cheers that rolled along the Kale Mayor were measured as though every throat in Madrid had learned caution. I slipped through the crowds toward the palace, robe hem brushing puddles left by spring rain, and felt the city breathe a thin sigh of relief instead of jubilation. Spain, like a patient after fever, was alive but tender in every joint. Inside the royal chapel, I found Maria Cristina beside the altar, still in her dust-streaked travel cloak, for she had ridden back from the front to announce the news herself. She dismissed the brass-buttoned officers clustered around her and motioned me closer. The marble floor, polished to mirror brightness, reflected to weary figures rather than the triumphant pair the court expected. "Father," she whispered, fingers tightening on her rosary, "victory costs less ink than mercy. How do we mend what war has taught men to do?" I briefly thought of Ferdinand's jared monstrosity slumbering beneath these stones, of how power once chose to hide deformity instead of heal it, and I realized the first answer had to be transparency. "We begin," I said, "by refusing to bury any more truths alongside the dead. Spain must learn to confess in daylight. She exhaled as if releasing a weight no coronet could balance. Together, we knelt before the crucifix. Her whispered litany named towns gutted by siege, sons missing in mountain passes, and daughters turned widows before their first child could walk. When she finished, I offered no absolution. I offered no absolution only. The promise that sorrow voiced aloud is the prolonged seedbed of justice. Days slipped into weeks. Wagon loads of maimed soldiers filled hospital wards beyond the Puerta del Sol. Daily, I made my rounds, hearing confessions that smelled of laudanum and singed wool. Some men begged forgiveness for atrocities. Others begged permission to forget them. I answered each according to conscience, always returning to the idea that truth unspoken becomes rot beneath scar tissue. One afternoon, an orderly summoned me to a private ward guarded by 2 stalwart halberdiers. Inside lay a rebel colonel, pale as wax, his leg taken at the knee. He pushed the other attendants away and confessed that he had once been Ferdinand's page one of the boys who suffered for glimpsing that grotesque secret. Now, decades later, he felt the kingdom's wounds pulsing through his stump. I marched for Carlos because I hated the lie that put a girl on the throne. He rasped, but hatred is just another form of hiding. Will God hear a penitent who spent his life avenging a childhood terror? I pressed my palm to his bandaged thigh warm through blood-stained Gazan Tolim pain. When named, becomes prayer. We prayed until sunset painted the plaster walls crimson, a color too familiar to both of us. When he fell asleep at last, tears drying on his cheeks, I realized Spain's true reconciliation would come less from treaties than from bedside moments like this. Autumn's first frost arrived, wearing diplomats' gloves. Ambassadors flooded the city to discuss trade concessions and border protocols. In smoky salons, they toasted Isabella as the peacemaker child, the monarch born of compromise. Yet I watched her more closely than any envoy. At 13, she practiced the art of steady. Gaze eyes level with each noble who knelt, neither shrinking nor glinting with vanity. Sometimes, after evening prayers, she sought me in the chapel vestibule. "Father," she asked once, tracing candle drips hardened on a pew, "is it possible to rule without fear when every corridor remembers my grandfather?" "It is possible," I replied, "only if you let light touch every corridor." That very night, I requested audience with the regent and proposed what many would call sacrilege, the formal destruction of Ferdinand's secret relic. Maria Cristina blanched, for even she had never seen the jar, but she did not refuse. Court night. Later she, the princess, General Espartero, and I descended a narrow staircase to a vaulted chamber where 2 lanterns guttered in stale air. An iron box rested on a pedestal like a reliquary. The key, long kept by the captain of the guard, squealed. In the lock. Inside, floating in amber liquor, lounged the organ that had once commanded physicians, queens, and a kingdom. The girl queen recoiled, but she did not avert her eyes. Instead, she reached for my arm, steadying both of us. "This," I said softly, "was the idol of a small soul. Your Spain will not worship it." We carried the box to the palace furnace, normally reserved for fouled linens. I murmured Psalm 51 while General Espartero tilted the jar into the flames. Glass cracked, spirits hissed. Flesh shriveled to cinder. When the furnace door clanged shut, an almost imperceptible pressure lifted from my chest, though the building itself inhaled after a century of stifled air. Word of the event leaked inevitably. Courtiers gossiped that the regent had burned evidence of scandal. Reactionary pamphlets called it desecration. I welcomed every rumor. Each retelling, however skewed, dragged the secret further into daylight, where it could no longer warp the corridors of power. Winter turned the Manzanares to glass. On Christmas Eve, Isabella stood before a packed cathedral and read a proclamation I helped her craft. She acknowledged the sins of fathers, the grief of mothers, and the shared duty of children to break inherited chains. She pledged land, grants for veterans, alms for war widows, and new schools in provinces scarred by battle. Most daring of all, she announced the Crown's consent to a court-test debate on a limited charter of rights-up. Seat of liberty, once trampled by her grandfather. The applause rolled like organ thunder. After Mass, I lingered at the back pew. Candlelight gilded dust motes drifting above the congregation, tiny specks, each alight for an instant before sinking into shadow. I realized that my own work, so long defined by whispered absolutions and sealed lips, was nearing completion. Confession had done its task. It unearthed, wrought, named it, and laid ground for fresh growth. 2 weeks later, I received permission to retire to a monastery overlooking the green waves of the Cantabrian Sea. On my final night in the palace, Isabella asked me to bless her. She knelt not as a monarch, but as a pilgrimand. I traced the cross on her brow. Remember? I advised every law you sign is a kind of confession. Let it tell the truth. She smiled, eyes bright with something stronger than innocence. Resolve. Dawn carried me north along roads now safe enough for lone travelers. Farmers guiding oxen paused to tip their hats. Children shouted, "Padre, confessor," as if the title were a folk hero's. I lifted a hand in reply and kept writing. Heart light. Years later, from my seaside cell, I heard that Isabella's charter survived fierce debate and entered law. Spain did not transform overnight, no nation does, but the plague of secrets eased. Historians hunted for Ferdinand's jar and found only furnace ash, a footnote to mark an empire's turning point. I still keep a ledger of confessions, though now they belong to fishermen, seamstresses, and wind-burned sailors. Their sins are humblies told for profit. Jealousy over a neighbor's catch-butt, I treat each with the gravity I once reserved. For royalty, for I understand at last, whenever shame festers unseen, kingdoms shrink into chambers without air. But when truth meets light, even the faintest soul can breathe again. And so I end this chronicle as I began, with the secret laid bare. I loved the palace. I loved its marbled hush, its gardens perfumed under midnight torches, its feeling of history inside every echoing step. Yet that love almost blinded me to cruelty. Only when a jar cracked in fire did I learn the shape of real devotion, to shepherd the living, not to preserve the dead, to break jars, not to guard them. If these pages ever reach another confessor walking palace halls, remember, secrets are easier to guard than truths, but truths build better walls. Speak them, even when they burn your tongue like spirits in a furnace. Spain's future, or any nation's, depends not on the size of its rulers' monuments, but on the breadth of its people's honesty. The tide is high. Evening sun strikes the waves, turning foam to gold. I close my book, dip a quill for the final notation, and breathe the salted air without fear that it might turn foul again. The confession is complete.